We have two very interesting papers this morning. I'm going to request people who are coming in early to do me a favor and occupy the seats this side so that people who are stragglers will have less distance to traverse. And as many of you may have noticed, this is a dance floor. The real dance floor with springs under the wooden boards. And so that means that the cameramen who are recording this are having a real springy time. And they really want people to walk as little as possible towards the area in which they are. So I'm trying to cut the distance that people have to travel to be able to occupy their seats. So the stragglers are better off coming directly to this side. I'd appreciate it. Thank you so much. Also request you to silence your phones if you can, please. We have two interesting papers this morning, Women and Work, which could not have been a more topical choice, given that, A, it's on our minds. Avinash Dixit very pointedly showed what it means to have 27% female labor force participation, or 26%, compared to other countries which are closer to 80-90%. So half of our workforce really isn't doing much in a way in which they can contribute using comparative advantage and have efficient and productive contributions to the economy. So we're very fortunate to have this paper, and then we have a very good paper after that on exports. Thereafter there's lunch, and then we do something we started last year, which is to reflect back on the discussions of the last 2 days and give it a theme. And this year's theme is the priorities effectively for the new government, so 2019 to 2024. And we have a very eminent panel that's going to talk about that. In the evening, of course, we have the highlight of the 15th anniversary celebrations, which is a conversation with Arvind Subramaniam as he steps down from his 4 years as the Chief Economic Advisor. I might suggest to some of you, and we will actually do this, to be able to do the before and after. Karthik Mullidharan, who is going to talk to Arvind Subramaniam, did a similar 2-hour interview almost with Arvind back in 2015. And we'll have that playing in the gap between the end of the India Policy Forum and the start of the talk itself. So you will really have a good sense of the before and after. How has Arvind Subramaniam metaphosed during these 4 years, and how has his views changed or not changed? Again, with that, welcome everybody. And I'm going to hand over to Renana Jhabvala, who is our eminent chair for this panel. Renana.
Thank you very much. And I'm very happy that we actually have this session on women and work. Personally, in my own work, I see this as an extremely important topic. And I see it as an extremely important topic, not only in terms of statistics that women are less, but also in terms of what can we do about it. And so I'm very pleased that there is a great analysis of women and work in the paper that we're going to hear. And also I'm very pleased that you have the beginnings of policy of what we can do about it. And I do hope that the discussants will take that up a little bit. What can we do about increasing the number of women in the workforce? So let me hand it over to Charity. I think we were instructed, thank you, instructed not to give introductions. So Charity, do you want to just start?
Sure, thank you so much. And I've got my timer set, so. And I'm very glad to hear that this is not an issue of structural instability, which is what I thought was happening yesterday, so it's just a dance. So I'm here to present work called Women and Work in India, Descriptive Evidence and a Review of Potential Policies, and this is joint with Rohini Pande and Erin Fletcher from Harvard's Kennedy School. And I think much of the motivation for actually writing a paper like this, and I think, I'll just echo Renana about this, that it's exciting to just see this as a topic in the forum. So very happy and thankful, Shekhar, that we have this opportunity. The motivation, I think some of this was discussed a little bit last night and in some of the different papers, is we see India has had a very strong GDP growth. There's been, of course, this transformation of people moving out of, or the share of agriculture in GDP is actually declining and the share of services is increasing, which we might think would be associated with some form of increase in female labor force participation. And probably more importantly, total fertility dropped from 4 children per woman to 2.5 children per woman since the early 90s. We also see that girls' school enrollment has increased and now reached parity with boys, and the fraction of women ages 15 to 24 attending educational institutions has increased by 20 percentage points. So these are things that we might think would be associated with, kind of women's economic involvement, but in fact we see that only 27% of India's women are participating in the labor force. So, and this is a low figure. It's the lowest of any country in the G20 outside of Saudi Arabia, and it's actually declined, and I think this is kind of one of the most concerning things is it's declined quite strongly in recent years. And in fact, it's not too surprising that India's female labor force participation would decline as India is developing. There's kind of this commonly, it's basically a stylized fact about this U-shaped labor force participation hypothesis, and that's that, as countries develop and women have the opportunity to consume more leisure, this income effect dominates, and there's one income earner in the household that then dominates. They pull out of the labor force, and then eventually, as they become more educated and service sector jobs or jobs that are more appealing to women become more widely available, they'll then opt back into the labor force. So there are some people, there's some contention as to whether this really happens in practice, but we do at least see from this figure here that if you plot GNI per capita versus the male to female labor force participation rate, there's a U shape in that graph, but India and Pakistan are both quite far off the U in terms of female labor force participation. And interestingly enough, it sounds like Pakistan's female labor force participation is on the rise, whereas India's is still declining, so Pakistan's may soon eclipse India's. And India's female labor force participation also really varies greatly by state, so this is just plotting the level of female labor force participation by state, and you see that Himachal in the north is the state with the highest labor force participation, or Sikkim also, over 70%, and then a place like Bihar, only about 6% of women are counted in the labor force. I mean, it's nearly zero, right? And then this was a great suggestion from Kartik. He suggested we just go ahead and plot the residuals for labor force participation by women after controlling for education and income levels by state, and we see that we have kind of these positive outlier states too in terms of their female labor force participation being higher than what we would expect it to be. Again, there, Himachal stands out in some places in the northeast, but also Andhra and Chhattisgarh. So kind of interesting to think about what is it that they might be doing, or what are some of the factors there that might be driving, this higher than expected labor force participation. So why do we care about this? I think for someone like me who does this all the time, I don't even think about this, but I think it's important that we state it. If women aren't participating in the labor force at a level that is reflecting their education and ability and so on, there are these labor misallocations that can very much be growth constraining. And there was a paper a while ago that showed that just a 10% increase in the female to male ratio of workers would increase per capita net domestic product here in India by 8%. I think another macro rationale that we don't talk enough about is sex ratio. They don't have it here, but there's clear causal evidence that when women's relative earnings improve, at least in China, this is work by Nancy Chen, that sex ratios there actually improved as well. And this is, I think, a very pressing problem in India. Along with that, I think there are issues of safety and violence that we don't have much evidence on, but all the recent news about India being the rape capital of the world and these type of things leads one to wonder what connection there is with this economic issue as well. And then in terms of kind of other micro-level evidence that we have related to women working, we know that their economic engagement delays age of marriage, first birth. It increases women's decision-making power in the household and child schooling. And then there are these positive spillovers on other family members, notably women, typically. And then even when women don't necessarily participate in the labor force, but they at least have access to it, it can improve women's educational attainment, delay age of marriage, childbearing, and so on. So there are lots of positive things we could see by increasing female labor force participation. And then just one kind of final motivating graph. This is just plotting NFHS data looking at women's empowerment as basically described using a principal components analysis, looking at decision making on a variety of expenditures that were reported in the old NFHS, and I'm sorry this is not the newer one, but we see that women who do any sort of work outside the household have significantly more decision-making power regardless of the education level that they have, which I think is an important thing to consider. Okay, so before I go further, I think we should talk about what this paper is and then what it's not. We include in this paper a targeted survey of recent literature. I say targeted because we don't get everything. And this was something we had kind of put together a while ago and then let sit for a while, so I think we might even be slightly out of date. But we're trying to better understand the supply and demand side constraints to women's labor force participation. We do some descriptive analysis. It's primarily just based on one round of the NSS, and it's really just exploratory in nature. We did this several years ago when we were trying to think about what should our priorities be, knowing that we're interested in this topic in terms of, we work with policymakers, thinking about evaluations, this type of thing. And then we also just focus on how this evidence relates to policy instruments, and we really focused on ones that, were receiving kind of more attention as well, and ones that the data could speak to. And we do hope to complement recent work. We kind of sat on this for a long time because we felt like other people had, were kind of doing a lot of good diagnostic work, and this was just, an exploratory bit that we had done. But we do very much kind of hope to build on that. And so Farzana, I guess, is one of these people, and then some others, I'm not sure if they're here in the room, have done some interesting and helpful work related to this. So what's this paper not? It's not particularly sophisticated, it's not narrow or entirely exhaustive, so I'm just warning you all ahead of time. And we're focusing on, it's not focused on quantifying female labor force participation. There's a whole kind of discussion that could be had about what's truly the level of female labor force participation. And it's not trying to address survey data issues as well. So I'm going to present some summary statistics from data that I completely agree with you ahead of time if anyone brings it up, that it's kind of flawed or an ambiguous set of questions that are sometimes difficult to interpret, but I think that regardless of the exact interpretation, there's some key takeaways that we can pull from that. So the data that we use is the NSS, as I mentioned, largely here, the 2011 and 12 employment module. Has over 100,000 women and men aged 15 to 70 who are not currently enrolled in school. So all the figures that you see when we're talking about younger women who might plausibly be enrolled in school, we don't have those women in the analysis. We're not thinking at all about kind of these education trade-offs because women are in school longer than they used to be. And we focus on the usual principal activity, which those of you who work with the NSS, there's usual or secondary activities. We just look at the first one. So I want to just summarize quickly a few more points that people have said before, but we think are kind of salient and important to think about in terms of policy. That is first that the relationship between female labor force participation and education for women, but not for men, is U-shaped. So I don't think this is too surprising, but in both rural and urban areas, as you'll see on the right-hand side, we see the lowest labor force participation by women with these middle levels of education. And so we expect that these women with the lowest levels of education are taking kind of more menial jobs or may still be working in agriculture. The ones with the highest education, of course, have these more lucrative, probably service sector or oriented jobs. And the ones in the middle are the ones that are really suffering. We also see that rural female labor force participation is higher than urban. This is well documented in the Clayson and Peters paper, looking at this over time. And that female labor force participation is much lower for higher castes. So this figure plots female labor force participation and the social group. On the top, you see SC groups, so women there are participating about 40%, above 40% until kind of older ages. And then below that is, it switches at one point, but is basically ST, then OBC, and then these other Hindus, which would be general caste, and Muslims as well, have a significantly lower female labor force participation. And now I just want to highlight some what we call 5 facts in our paper that we felt like hadn't been emphasized other places. And once again, this is oriented to kind of policy, the policy focus at the time that we were beginning to work on this paper and the data that's available from the NSS. The first fact that I think is really important to think about is that there's a significant portion of women who are not considered in the labor force, they're out of the labor force, but they actually express some form of willingness to work. There's a question in the NSS that says it is only asked of women that say that they are occupied fully with domestic duties. And so these women are counted out of the labor force. And sorry, just to clarify, you're counted in, I think most of us know this, but you're counted in the labor force whether you're employed or not. And if you are unemployed but willing to work or seeking work, you would be counted in the labor force. So these women are outside of that realm entirely. They're out of the labor force. They say that they're fully occupied with domestic duties, but then the NSS followed up with a question that said, would you be willing to take work if it were offered to you? And over 30% of the women that we considered out of the labor force say yes, they would actually be willing to take this work. And if these women worked, there would be a 21 percentage point rise in female labor force participation. This is quite striking. I think it's a nice headline. I was at Dean's session yesterday, and I think headlines are valuable in some ways. And this, I think, is kind of the headline of the paper to be thinking about, is that there is this kind of latent labor supply, and we're actually counting these women out of the labor force entirely. Now, there are some potential problems with the survey question. I think we should be upfront about that, but nevertheless, it's there. And we see the highest latent labor supply among these rural, highly educated women. Nearly half of them say, yes, if there were work that were brought to my household, I would undertake it. Let's see. The second fact that we highlight is that job matching itself appears to be more difficult for females than males. So, first of all, women who are out of the labor force and who are considered part of this group of willing female workers, they report that they're willing to take on regular part-time work almost 3/4 of the time, and then 22% of the time they said that they would actually want full-time work. So that's interesting. That's useful to know that there are these part-time opportunities that seem like they would be appealing to women that are not considered in the labor force now. And the other kind of fact about this, backing this up, is there are questions that are asked in the NSS about time spent searching for jobs. And if you ask women who were not working in the previous year, how many months did you spend time searching for jobs, and compare that to men, they actually are searching for a longer period of time. But they talk about searching with less intensity, and I think this might have to do with, demands from household production and all this type of thing, but nevertheless, it's there. And this is just looking at the type of work that women would accept if they're part of this willing workers group that are counted out of the labor force by their age. And we see that it's these youngest women between the ages of 15 to 20, so right around there, that are looking for full-time work, which makes sense. Many of them, in this group that we're looking at, they're out of school already. And if they don't have work, they're basically waiting to get married. And then regular part-time work, though, is the majority of the women at all ages would prefer that of this group of willing women workers. But if you look at the actual distribution of women in the economy, and we're comparing on the left-hand side, the actual employment of women in the labor force. And so we see there that about 80% of women who are in the labor force have regular full-time work. And then we look at the distribution of what type of work women would prefer if they're out of the labor force but say that they're willing to work, and we see most of them actually prefer this regular part-time work. Now, the women who are in the labor force and who are out of the labor force, obviously we think they have very different characteristics. There's probably more that we could do here to try to control for observable characteristics of these women and try to understand their preferences. But, this is just taking it at face value, suggesting that at least the types of jobs that women actually have are quite different from the distribution of jobs that those who are not in the labor force but say that they would like to work would prefer to have. The third fact that we emphasize is that we are looking at vocational training, and the context of this is, this was all during the time that Skill India was kind of getting off the ground. And we've since done kind of additional work with some of these programs. But we see that women with vocational training are more likely to work at all levels of education. And this is just a graph that shows this. We're looking at women, the lighter bar, and I apologize, I know there was all this backlash about the pink economic survey, and all of these bars are like pink or maroon. So I'm a little bit self-conscious about that. So we see on the left hand, the lighter pink is women with no training, and then kind of the reddish color is for women that have formal or informal vocational training, and we see that labor force participation, dividing by the skills training of some form or even informal training, is much higher for those who have already participated in the training. Once again, there's absolutely nothing causal we're trying to say about this. This is just kind of an interesting fact about labor force participation. I think it's worth, future investigation, kind of trying to understand that a little bit better. And in fact, we have followed up and done more related to this. The next kind of piece of this is that this group of willing women workers were also asked, what would you like to do? And many of them were talking about things kind of close to their home. And then when they said, or when they explained what they would like to do, they were asked, do you have the skills needed to actually undertake that? And you'll see something like animal husbandry, only less than 40% of the women who are saying, I don't have work, I would take work, I'd like to participate in some form of livestock rearing, but I don't know what I should be doing for it. So, and I think some of the government's recent initiatives have tried to address this type of thing exactly, but there does seem to be kind of a skills gap for them. The fourth thing that we highlight is that wage gaps and unexplained wage gaps are higher in fields with greater female representation. So I'm going to explain it verbally and then I'll show you the figures. So the sectors in which females tend to fare relatively better in terms of the wage gaps are often those in which they are least represented. And I think some of the interpretation of this is that there could very much be some form of a mobility constraint for women, wherein these employers are basically monopsonists and they're able to buy labor at lower prices for the women. And we see in other work that I've done that women's representation in manufacturing actually is growing, but the wage gaps there are very high. And so this is the graphical version of this. For both of the figures, the proportion of the workers in the sector that are female is the x-axis, and then the y-axis on the left is the female wage as a proportion of a male wage. And you see that as women's representation in the sector increases, their relative raw wage is lower compared to men's. And I'm sorry, I think the bottom of the graph gets cut off here, but the different colors are the different types of work. So the green is agriculture, the X's are manufacturing, and the pink are service sector. And this is all based on NIC codes. And then we see on the right-hand side that the unexplained wage gap increases with these sectors that women are more highly representative, they're a larger portion of the workforce in that sector. And we look at this using Waxhachka-Blinder decompositions. We're controlling for things like social group, education, state fixed effects, marital status in these regressions. So it's holding all of those constant, still we have this residual variation that's in the wage gap that's not explained by these observables. And that's commonly attributable to some form of discrimination. And then finally, we find that there are fields with female-friendly policies that do have higher female representation. I think the most obvious one that most of us probably know about is NREGA. So 52% of NREG's workers are female, and this is compared to 22% of the labor force overall is actually female. And there could be several reasons for this, right? So first is there's this mandated wage parity across genders. If you look at survey data, the wages are actually not at parity, but they're closer than kind of typical agricultural wages. Obviously, the work is available locally to women. And then finally, there is a gender quota in the program. I think it's 30 or maybe 35% of workers have to be women. But when you look at a place like Kerala, it's over 90% of the NREGA workers there are women. So it's quite striking. It's not that the quota is actually kind of the lower bound in a place like Kerala. Another sector where women are relatively well represented is education. And in the paper, we reflect on the fact that Operation Blackboard, which was initiated many years ago now, actually supported a contract teacher, which was typically a woman that came into schools, and it had a 50% quota for women at that point in time. And so we see that education, this potentially is reflected in education as well. Once again, entirely suggestive. There's not much we can say about causality. And then I just want to quickly run through kind of what we found in the literature that we thought was relevant, salient to kind of some of these questions about female labor force participation. And our criteria for this, I mean, this is not any form of like a systematic literature review, but we did have, certain parameters that was relatively targeted. We only looked at papers that had a strong causal identification strategy, so some form of randomization or quasi-experimental variation. We looked in top academic journals and working papers from 2004 to 2017, and then we included a few others with clear relevance from either. So this is where it was slightly hand-wavy, where we felt like there really are some additional papers that would be relevant to this situation. And just in summary, what we find is that the supply of female labor increases by addressing information asymmetries about market opportunities. I think there's some well-known work here that suggests that even just providing information about labor force opportunities can increase not only women's education, but also labor force participation. Also by addressing mobility constraints, proximity to jobs, and this is some work in India, but also then Bangladesh and Pakistan, focusing on contract teachers again. but proximity to jobs increases female labor force participation. There's been some work that suggests that training itself and then bundled inputs, I'm sorry, that's Abhijit, I think the targeted poverty graduation programs where they combine training, assets, and credit, they bundle all these things to try to address the multiple constraints that people face. Other things that I think are interesting and relevant that come out from the literature, it's clear that, and this is some work by, anything that says field usually also is Rohini, one of my co-authors. So this was work in West Bengal looking at leveraging peer networks, so having women who were invited to participate or going to participate in business training were allowed to invite a peer, and they find that the women who were allowed to invite a peer, particularly those in kind of so Muslims and then others with kind of more stricter caste obligations are more likely when they bring these friends to then undertake some form of business activity afterwards. And so this kind of gets at this issue of, social constraints and norms being an issue, but, having others in networks to help kind of walk with you through this can be very helpful. Improving outside options, I don't know if I worded that well. I think the point is, when we're thinking of some form of a non-unitary household model, it's very important that women have some form of fallback points that they can go back to. The second paper is one that I'm on and also Rohini's on, where we look at transferring DBTs instead of transferring Norego wages directly to the head of the household, we instead target the wage directly to the woman, so it increases her relative potential income in the household, and we actually find that not only do women work more in Norega, but they also work more in the casual agricultural market. And then finally, female leaders. This is something I think that's been looked at a lot because of reservation, but there are actually labor market or economic impacts of having local female leaders. Obviously, this could come through a large variety of mechanisms. It might be kind of aspirational, it might be related to the types of goods that female leaders are investing in. There are lots of reasons this could be. One thing that we don't talk a lot about, at least kind of in the micro world, is thinking through how kind of macroeconomic policies may affect female labor force participation. I think there's one interesting paper here that we should just mention, and that's that this is a woman who's showing that during trade liberalization, the share of women in sectors that were most affected by trade liberalization begins to decline. And that's probably due to the fact that the factories law was then in place, and she was telling me that she did find actually that in states that have a stronger regulatory mechanism wherein they would go in and do factory inspections to ensure that women were not working, it's in these states where women's relative participation declines even more. So even though trade liberalization we think was a very good thing overall, because of kind of these distortive rules, could be that it actually forces women out of the labor force. And then just one final thing to note is, obviously we think economics and norms are linked. So there's interesting work that's talking about kind of the historical origins of gender norms, this type of thing. And this paper, again, that I'm citing with colleagues, we look at what happens, and this is one I was mentioning, where we kind of target DBT to women instead of to the head of the household. And we actually, interestingly enough, just a couple of years later, find that people's roles and views on roles in the household, particularly women's, change. And I think that's quite surprising and interesting. A lot of times we throw up our hands and say this is like a cultural thing, this is a norms thing, you can't push against that. I think, as economists, hopefully we aren't that pessimistic, but I think we were very, excited that we could see changes in reported norms, at least over such a short period of time. It was a little bit surprising. And then we conclude and talk about potential policy levers for future investigation. And so hopefully this gets to a bit of what Renana was saying earlier. So there are a few different areas that we think can be really valuable for government to be thinking about here. One is thinking about gender-specific information asymmetries. And I note here skilling as a potential tool. We've been working with skilling programs, and we find actually that only 1 in 4 trainees of a very large program, or female trainees of a very large government program who actually enter it, have a job for 3 or more months, 6 months later. So the outcomes themselves are not that good. But a well-implemented skilling program is also a way to get information about jobs to people. And if you go to rural areas, the information about potential job opportunities is quite limited. And of course, another area that would be potentially important is thinking through local part-time work opportunities for these women who say that they're willing workers. There may have been some form of desirability bias in this reporting. It may not be that they actually take up this type of work if it's available to them. I think that's something that we should consider, but it seems like it's worth giving it a try. And one of Kartik's suggestions as well was thinking about, the public sector. We know that the public sector is overloaded, particularly, from recent work that's been done, I think of block officers was really interesting, but then even at the local level, if you go and talk with these individuals who are overseeing GP activities, they're all quite overloaded. So is there room to incentivize more employment, possibly part-time, maybe not, of women through this? Obviously, technologies or policies to decrease the cost of household production. I think there's a lot of time commitments that women have. We don't really go into that much in the paper, but I think it's a relevant thing to be thinking about. And then increasing women's relative unearned income, possibly through some form of transfers. The government's providing a whole lot of money to people now, and so thinking through what's the right distribution strategy to not, disincentivize women from working or to give them increased bargaining power within the household, which is exactly what happened in the study that I was mentioning with my colleagues. How can we promote more of that? And I think that there's more of that thinking going on. In terms of quotas, they seem like they've been successful, relatively successful, at least prima facie, in public sector programs. I think there's more that could be done to understand, is there room for more in the public sector? And when we're thinking about the private sector, I don't know, maybe people want to put more quotas in beyond the board quotas, but are there additional levers that we can put in place to change kind of the relative return to hiring women? I think is another question to ask, maybe through something more like subsidies. And then a final thing that I think the government should think about, and this maybe, I hope it's not out of the blue, but just reflecting on both the data work here, the literature, and kind of just having lived and worked in India for a while, is thinking about preferences themselves. There's a lot that the government does to promote the role of women as a homemaker or women as a mother, which seems like, not a problem. But if you go back to Claudia Golden's work, one explanation she has about why US women came back into the labor force, or the narrative that she tells is that women began to view their role not just as the housewife or the mother, but instead as a career woman. And promoting a narrative like that could be effective. I think whether that's palatable to the current government, that's up for consideration. And then, of course, in all of this, it's really important to think about data and research priorities. I think I just rattled off a bunch of different things that could be tried, but cost effectiveness, is really important to consider. I think there are several questions, of course. What can the government do? What can the government do well, and what's really cost effective? So there's a huge opportunity cost and there are trade-offs to actually trying these. One other thing that I think is really valuable is having states try out different things. And just to mention, in additional work that we did with this, we look at, I just mentioned that women's outcomes for skilling are not good. But if you go instead and look at women from ERISA, you find that twice the rate of women are actually accepting jobs and remaining in jobs for more than 3 months, so nearly 1 in 2 women there. And they're actually performing better than men. So there are these questions of how is it that ERISA is doing so much better than some of the other states? Is it their program? Is it the context? What is it about the context that's different for them? I think are important to investigate. And then in our paper too, we talk a little bit about data collection. And when we first wrote the paper, we said there need to be more frequent surveys. Fortunately, there are now. That's great. The government has also mandated this time use survey, which is great. We'll see if it happens. And of course, more related to credible evaluations and use of administrative data. I think there's much more that could be done there, but the administrative data frameworks are often quite limited. And then, building on that, data sharing and transparency would obviously be very important. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charity. That was really excellent, and I hope we have a good discussion around it. And so then I turn to the first discussant, Pranab Bardhan, and it's about 10 minutes, I think, for each discussant.
Thank you. Let me say that I'm going to essentially read off the text of my slides. There are many reasons for it, but the most important reason is that I was awake until around 2 a.m. last night because I was watching the semi-final of the World Cup game. So I'm not that particularly coherent this morning. And secondly, given the shortness of time, it will help me that way. Let me start by saying that in general, I agree with most of the points made in this paper about the characteristics and trends described and the policy issues raised. My comments and suggestions, therefore, are mainly supplementary and rather piecemeal. One point that I wanted to start with is the paper simultaneously discusses both low and declining female labor force participation. For analysis, the two aspects should be separated more clearly, partly because factors explaining them can be different. The level and the decline, the low level and the decline. For example, gender norms or social expectations which may explain part of low FLFP may not be used as easily in explaining declining FLFP, even when those norms and expectations are not quite immutable. Across countries, even after reading this paper and a few other related papers, it is still not clear to me why India and Pakistan are so much of an outlier. Are so low FLFP, even compared to their poorer South Asian neighbors like Nepal and Bangladesh. Particularly if you think about the Hindu cultural norms of Nepal or the Muslim cultural norms of Bangladesh, they're not that different with respectively India or Pakistan. So I'm yet to fully understand that puzzle, why India and Pakistan are so much of an outlier. In fact, the only comparators for India and Pakistan in respect of FLFP, I think, is Saudi Arabia and one or two other countries around in that region. One somewhat major suggestion that I have for the authors is that they look at the National Sample Survey usual status data, where the reference period is actually over the last 1 year, which is important. But given the fragmentary and part-time nature of a great deal of women's work, one should also try to make full use of another part of NSS data. NSS collects data on what they call also current status data, where the reference period is the previous week. And one advantage of that data set is that they not merely ask if the woman was in the workforce in the previous week, but also give you a detailed time disposition. Each day, last Monday, how many hours did you work? So if she worked roughly half the day, the number is half. So it's a detailed time disposition, data is available. And you can do statistical analysis of that detailed time disposition data for the women in the NSS current status data. In fact, and here if you may indulge a bit of self-referential on my part, I have done many decades back, and this is to tell you how ancient I am, early 1980s, I published a paper in American Economic Review on a statistical examination of NSS data. In fact, I think that was the first NSS household level data statistical examination. Then I actually substantially revised that paper, and it came out as the first 2 chapters of my book, Land, Labor and Rural Poverty, which came out in 1984. And these 2 chapters are essentially largely about, not entirely about, but largely about female labor force participation. I analyzed statistically both the determinants of usual labor force participation, like what Charity has done, but also current labor force, the previous week. And one of the things that I wanted to emphasize, that one issue, Charity didn't emphasize it that much, but it's in the paper, one issue that's important in this literature, in trying to understand women's workforce participation, how much is due to supply side and how much due to demand factors. Problem is the demand factors are not, from the data, difficult to separate out. Now, so I tried to do that in that AER paper, but also more importantly in the first 2 chapters of that book. And I found at least 3 demand-side factors which I have not seen in the subsequent literature and nor in this paper of Charity and co-authors. So for example, and the dependent variable here is the number of days the woman worked in the previous week. That is the dependent variable. Now, I will identify 3 demand-side factors. The rainfall pattern in the area, of course, the area means in this case, somewhat crudely, the district where the household, because that's the level where I could get rainfall data. So better rainfall areas, women work more. By the way, my analysis is there in that paper, or in that 2 chapters of the book, is mostly rural women. So better rainfall areas, there are more women's participation. Second, which is very useful, NSS collects data by sub-rounds, 4 sub-rounds a year. And so they have the different sub-rounds have different seasonality. So in the busy season, more women participate. And then they withdraw in the lean season. So that certainly has something to do with the demand factors. And that can be captured from looking at the sub-round-wise variation, NSS sub-round-wise variation, seasonality of coming in and withdrawing. One factor which I did not expect, but I found in that analysis, is that controlling for other factors in households with more male members unemployed, days of female work participation are less. One would have expected that when the male members are unemployed, you try to work more. The income effect would work for more participation. No, women withdraw much more. So I'd call it as an indicator of the discouraged dropout effect in seeking work in families where the more male members are unemployed. So these are kind of demand factors that I've analyzed in those first 2 chapters. And of those first 2 chapters, the second chapter is entirely on something, I think that was the first basic fact that Charity you mentioned, about women who are withdrawing from the labor force, not even seeking work. They're in quote-unquote domestic work, but they are also willing to work. This is something that the paper very rightly emphasizes. And I have an analysis of that in second chapter of my book, but relating to earlier NSS rounds. The next point that I want to mention now is about the decline, the puzzle of the decline of FLP. I would suggest, and decline is particularly a puzzle because of, in the face, as the paper mentions, in the face of education gains and fertility reduction. Even in spite of that, the decline, I would suggest that if it's possible, one should try to cross-check with the panel data. Unfortunately, that not too many data sets of panel data, but for example, the IHDS data, the India Human Development Survey, have data pursuing the same household between 2004-05 and 2011-12, and one might get some insight from analyzing the panel data that's available not in NSS, but in IHDS. Let me now speculate on some additional explanations for the decline in FLFP. I mentioned in this slide 3. I'll mention those 3, then 2 others came to my mind later. First one, with environmental degradation, collection activities mainly done by women, for example, collection of water and firewood, may take up increasing amount of time in the day, leaving less time for quote-unquote gainful work. So that's maybe one extra reason for the decline. Second, with income and education improving, the same oppressive, dead-end, low-status jobs which women have been working on for generations are now less acceptable. Thus, declining FLFP can actually be welfare improving in some cases. A third additional explanation I would have, in many lines of activity, with possibly worsening job prospects for the men in the family, this is in connection with the statistical findings that I mentioned before, with possibly worsening job prospects for the men in the family, the discouraged dropout effect on women may get stronger. Let me now add two others, which are not in my slides. A fourth factor may be in areas of India where agriculture is being mechanized. Now there one is a little more complex. Some mechanization does not primarily replace female labor. So for example, tractors. Tractors largely is a substitution for plowing, soil preparation, transportation. And those are mainly male activity in Indian agriculture. But there are other kinds of mechanization, for example, harvester combines. So in harvesting, post-harvest processing, winnowing, food processing, etc., there women participate in a big way. And so mechanizing those operations are female labor replacing. So it might be worth checking about areas where mechanization of those women-specific jobs are on, whether that's a reason. A fifth reason for the decline, let me offer, which is even more speculative, there's an increasing perception of declining safety of women in public places in many parts of India. Whether this perception of increasing unsafety of women coming out in public, whether that has anything to do with the decline of female labor. I'll be just then a few other comments. A small comment on the ecological factor like soil quality discussed in section 3.04 of the paper. And I'll just say a related factor may be the particular crop grown. For example, some crops are much more female labor intensive than other crops. Rice, for example, in which cultivation as well as post-harvest operations is more female labor intensive than, say, wheat. So across Indian region, rice region versus wheat, etc., you will get variations in female labor force participation. Another comment, and here this is a supplementary comment, Charity mentioned the adverse impact of trade liberalization on female employment in the section 3.05 of the paper. Charity referred primarily to someone else's paper due to discriminatory factory laws. Let me add something else there. So there is a paper by Shanti Nautaraj, which came out in the Journal of International Economics 2011, where she shows, and she combines ASI, Annual Survey of Industries, formal sector data, and NSS, informal manufacturing sector data, combines the two and finds who bore the brunt of trade liberalization in India in manufacturing is primarily the informal sector. Informal, low productivity firms got wiped out as a result of trade liberalization. And obviously women are much more represented in the informal firms than in the formal firms. So to some extent, it may be that aspect rather than factory laws as such. I just wanted to point that out. On the explanation, and this is, I think, the fact number 4 in Charity's presentation, on the explanation of why the gender wage gap is distinctly higher in sectors where more women are represented. So I'm just speculating. Could it be that in work, like in the garment or beedi making industry, where the majority of workers are women, men mostly do the supervisory managerial work. And therefore, the gender gap, partly wage gap, partly may reflect the wage gap between production and managerial work. If most of the production work is done by women and the managerial work, supervisory work is done by men, then it is maybe reflecting that occupational difference in work. Lastly, some additional suggestions, not quite additional, supplementary suggestions on policy issues. The paper points to the latent labor supply Large numbers of women currently in domestic work express willingness to work. As I mentioned, I discussed this in the second chapter of my 1984 book. But if you look at the NSS question on this, and the paper refers to in footnote 14, they say that they are willing to work if the work is brought home. That's the language in the question. If that is the case, then the part-time work that women are looking for has to be dovetailed with domestic work. So the work, when work is brought home, like sewing, tailoring, animal husbandry, food processing, basket making, and other handicrafts. And if that is the case, then there are some special policy issues. And this must be related to the kind of thing Renana in SEWA is involved in. So special policy issues here involve provision of supplies, marketing and transportation, organization of cooperatives and self-help groups, etc. So for work brought to home, and they're willing to work if work is brought to home. So special policy issues for these women. I also want to push the idea of community kitchen and community daycare centers. Community kitchen like Amma canteens in Tamil Nadu, Indira canteens in Karnataka. I think these are great ideas which should be tried out now on an all India scale. And the important thing is that the effect will be not just on adult women's workforce participation. Another very big effect is on the schooling of elder daughters in the family. Because when the adult woman goes out to work, is that elder daughter who looks after the siblings. So some of the home activities are looked after by the daughter, and the daughter is withdrawn from school. So this will have an effect not merely on adult women's work participation, this community kitchen plus community daycare centers. This is my last point. So I think that's very important. And then something that Charity has already mentioned, extension service, specially oriented to women, located in nearby community centers or panchayat offices is imperative, not just with respect to new production technology, but also on information relating to job search, which is emphasized. Thank you very much.
Farzana?
So my points are actually sort of going to echo some of the issues that have been raised by Professor Bardhan. But broadly, I'm going to categorize them into two. One is trying to help you streamline the paper in terms of the discussion of descriptives and the data. And secondly, in terms of the policy recommendations, along with some suggestions, which I think should be included in the policy recommendations, some caution in the interpretation of the evidence that we have so far, and taking it forward in terms of what the government's emphasis should be. So the first point is, I think, exactly what Professor Bardhan mentioned. In terms of reading the paper seems to go back and forth between levels and trends. And as he said, exactly the same point I have is that the policy implications, when you think in terms of levels, can be very different than in terms of trends. So for example, if you just break up the data, then this comes from the paper that I have, which has just come out, that in rural areas, we see a decline in the women's labor force participation. So we use data from the NSS going from 1987 to 2011, the decline that we see across the country is driven by women in rural areas. Whereas in urban areas, there's stagnancy. But also there is a level difference, which I think you mentioned in the paper, of course, but it's getting sort of confusing in the sense that if you're going back and forth between levels and trends, it's hard to think of what the policy implications should be, because as the point is that in rural areas, the level of participation is higher compared to the urban areas, but the trend is declining in rural areas, whereas we see stagnancy in urban areas. So what is the reason that we see stagnancy in urban areas and we see declines in trends? So one of the reasons And I think, and that's why it's important to break it up again in terms of policy recommendations, but before that, the discussion is that in rural areas, a lot of the decline, the majority of the decline is due to the decline in agriculture. We know that agriculture is shrinking, and the women who reported being active in the labor market were essentially self-employed in agriculture. So for example, this figure shows that very clearly, that though we do not see much of an uptick in terms of participation of women in rural areas in manufacturing, construction, or service, the decline is happening in the agriculture sector. So do we need policies which focus specifically in seeing how these women who are moving out of agriculture are now going to get gainfully employed in other sectors? And again, in terms of the nature of work that they're doing, so you see self-employment is declining, and that is again being driven in rural areas by the decline, by the shrinking that we see in agriculture. So I think it's very important upfront to sort of break up the data to focus. If you're focusing on the levels, then let's just stick to levels, because your paper is looking at the 2011 census, the NSS, not looking at trends. But when you start drawing policy implications, you are starting to talk also about trends, which if you want to do that, then you want to sort of discuss how these could differ by the sectors, by the nature of the data that you're looking at. So that's number one point. So policy implications can vary depending on the location and the sector, and so we need to have the discussion starting up front. Second is in terms of demographic groups. So there is tremendous evidence now which would suggest that one of the biggest factors which leads to decline in women's labor force participation, if we want to think in terms of the life cycle of a woman, and I think that's important to do, because there can be very many different constraints when you're thinking of an adolescent girl versus a young woman who's just got married versus a woman who is married and has children. So for example, the data would suggest that for rural, for example, the married women in the 15 to 60 age group, only 20% have been in the labor force, and that is 30 percentage points lower than unmarried women. Of course, we realize that marriage is universal in our country, but then we also know that there can be norms which enforce that universality of marriage. And what is interesting again is when you think of the urban unmarried women, there's been stagnancy in terms of the labor force participation. So again, the reasons for these could be very different, and I'm going to kind of discuss that as I go forward. So one suggestion, of course, is then do you want to break this up again in terms of the policy recommendations you have? Which will be different depending on what demographic groups we are looking at. Younger women have a very narrow window, because the age at marriage still in India continues to be about 20. And so if you complete schooling by the time you are 18 years of age, then you have this 2-year narrow window in which you can be productive and be active in the labor market. And after that, the biggest constraint seems to be marriage, even more than having children. So do we need to attack that particular point in the life cycle of women? And what I would suggest is updating the analysis to 2014-15 NFHS. You do have a discussion of using the 2004 NFHS, which is now pretty dated, and we have the NFHS coming out recently, which will help us also understand how labor force participation rates would vary depending upon these demographic groups. Then in terms of policy recommendations, I think Charity had this in her discussion where she was discussing the supply side constraints and the demand side. It would be really nice if in the paper also the discussion is similar, so that it's easier for the reader to follow in terms of what are the constraints which can be attacked in terms of changing the preferences of households and behavior of households, which affects the supply side, as opposed to what the demand side constraints might be. And here I really want to highlight something which Professor Bardhan again mentioned earlier, which is that we know that these norms which are related to the division of labor within the household lead to higher elasticity of women's labor supply as opposed to men's, and non-substitutability between male and female labor in home production in India. And I think that is the number one issue and number one concern that we have, which is unpaid work by women. So whether we look at the NSS, we look at the IHTS, or any data set, you know, if you don't want to quibble about whether the trend is declining or it's stagnant and so on and so forth, we understand that most of these women are engaged in unpaid work. And so there are some low-hanging fruit here which can be impacted through policy. Number one, technology, and for this I would bring up, you know, one of the initiatives that the government has taken, which is the Jhabvala program, which can reduce the time that women are spending within the household in terms of collection of firewood, in terms of the time they spend cooking. Infrastructure, there's excellent evidence on electrification increasing the time that women can devote to the labor market by using small appliances which use electricity. And this is work which has been done in South Africa, which is extremely well identified. So all of these don't require, you know, changing norms, but essentially these are policies which are part of the whole initiative of the government, so to speak, in terms of, you know, poverty alleviation and improving infrastructure. We can go a long way. Now on the demand side, I think some of these Charity has mentioned, but I wanted to emphasize them in the sense of we want policies which create good jobs. We know that 95% of women who work in the informal sector, and they would want to move to formal sector jobs. So the demand side constraints essentially exist. And again, you know, when you go back to looking at the rural sector, how do we make these women transition from the work that they were doing in agriculture to getting them factory jobs? Again, encouraging flexible work hours. What kind of initiatives do we need to encourage the private sector firms? Do we need tax incentives and so on and so forth, which would encourage them to employ women? What are the incentives that they need to give flexible work hours to women? And going back to the discussion on the NREGA, again, providing safe and easier access. So we underline here safe as well, because there is a lot of concern about safety, and that is why they would want work closer to home, and that's why you see the effectiveness of NREGA. So again, classifying the recommendations into those that would address the supply and the demand side constraints would help the reader and also help the policymakers in terms of, you know, what are the takeaways that we have from this. And lastly, you know, I would caution in terms of interpretation of some of these some of the recommendations that you made. One was that, you know, which again is Professor Bardhan pointed out, that the willingness to work is the statement that is being made is not unconditional. It's conditional on availability at the household. And then that again goes back to the basic issue about unpaid work. The extra burden that women have of unpaid work, they want to look for work which will allow them to juggle both household production activities as well as being financially remunerative. Secondly is the relationship that you draw between vocational training and labor force participation. I know you cautioned us when you were presenting it, but I think it would be nice if it is also made sort of more upfront in the writing of the paper, that the women who choose to go for vocational training are also the women who want to participate in the labor market. So does providing vocational training lead to higher labor force participation? I'm not sure. And lastly, the pitfalls in extending the effects of political quotas to making a case for job quotas. I would caution against that. There is a lot of debate about the mechanisms through which political quotas lead to the effects that we see in the areas of health and education, and I'm not sure that job quotas in the private sector, or for that matter even the public sector, would have the same implications in terms of raising women's labor force participation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Farzana, and also for sticking to the time. So we have more time for discussion. Before I open up for discussion, there are a few remarks I would like to make, not completely on the paper, but in general. Firstly, I have always maintained that the NSS data severely undercounts women's work. And there are many, many micro studies which show this. I think if you compare it to the IHDS data, you see that also. And it is mainly the type of work that women do, which is at home and part-time, but which is for the market, like livestock, looking after livestock, or home-based work for the market. And almost all that work is not counted. Even work like domestic work is severely undercounted. So there is a very severe undercounting. That is not to say that the kind of work they do is earning much income. It's not good work, but it is there. And it's important to recognize it if we want to look at policy, because if that work is there, the issue is not how do you get rid of it, but how do you upgrade it, how do you make it better paying. So that, the second point I want to make is when we look at policy and women's work, we kind of always focus in on jobs, on wage employment, but 50% almost is self-employment. And there's very little focus on how to upgrade self-employment. There are many ways to upgrade self-employment, some of which exists, as I said, and some of which can be created, some of which can remain part-time. So, and especially when we talk about part-time work, a lot of it will become a form of self-employment, maybe dependent self-employment, but a form of self-employment. So I think this focus on self-employment is really missing in the whole policy debate, especially for women. And finally, just one thing about the paper. I noticed you said that bundled inputs are helpful, and then you put a question mark after that.
Oh, sorry, that was the citation didn't come up. It wasn't meant to question.
Okay, because we had done a study. I mean, we do a lot of that. SEWA does a lot of work on what you're calling bundled inputs, credit and skills and mobilization. And we have some studies on that which show that bundled inputs are very effective. So it's, okay, so I'd like to now open it up for discussion. And please do state your name and do speak into the mic. And could we keep it to questions rather than too many remarks? Thank you.
So I just want to make two remarks. The first is responding to Pranab's comment that it's hard to understand the trends in labor force participation on the basis of norms. Consider, for instance, a stigma for women to work, or for the males or the in-laws to prefer the women not to work. But they will let her work if there is sufficient poverty in the household. There's a trade-off for them, for the males or the in-laws, to allow the woman to work, okay, if she's going to bring in enough income. And as the household's earning improves, or wealth improves, then there is an income effect operating there, and then they will assert that the woman should not work. So that can generate the declining labor force participation. But second, some experiments I did giving loans to low-income households in West Bengal found that in terms of labor allocation within the household, a striking finding that the women were withdrawing from working on the labor market outside. And when we looked at the time allocation, it turned out they were not spending more time just in the household or in leisure or on household chores, but they were turning to self-employed businesses of their own, which is, I think, reinforcing Renana's point. But that raises the question. So one is inclined to think of that as an income effect. And so is that empowering women or not? Do women say that they actually much prefer to do the self-employed work at home? They like to socialize with other women, get out of the house and do that kind of work. On the other hand, it is possible that the norm effect that I described earlier is also kicking in. There's pressure from the males and the in-laws to not work outside the home. And they object less to self-employed business for that. So it's very hard to separate out the two effects. And so overall, I think I agree with your point that it's very hard to give a welfare interpretation. I find it very hard to make any welfare judgment about female empowerment from looking at female labor force participation.
Devesh Kapoor, I just wanted to reinforce the point made by Pranab and Farzana on the role of technology, which I think is quite underemphasized sort of in the paper, especially what types of technological change are displacing like women from work, as in agriculture or construction, and what types of technological change, especially within household, cooking fuels, kitchen implements like washing machines, or like Karthik's work on bicycles, like for girls, when they are sort of empowering women. And I think both are happening, and it would be good if the paper could emphasize that part.
Thank you.
Sujit Bhalla. I have a few macro comments, and I will end with what Renana asked at the beginning: what can we do in terms of the low labor force participation rate? So the three comments are as follows. First, we've had in India one of the largest expansions in education, of female education. They are about caught up with men's education, the younger force, and I think the implications of that will very strongly be towards an increase in labor force participation rates of women. Second, that how do we come to that conclusion? In earlier work that I've done on the emerging middle class and the middle class, what you find is in the emerging middle class, there is a withdrawal by women, backward bending supply curve, when they are in that category because of status reasons or whatever, cultural reasons, because India and Pakistan are the genuine outliers pointed out in the paper. But once you go into the middle class, then there's an increasing proclivity to work, and the middle class obviously is very much associated with education levels. Third, again, a complete macro picture, the story in the world over the next 20 years is going to be about the declining male labor force participation rates. Women labor force participation rates are increasing around the world, and the only two areas that they have declined in are in Asia, dominated by India and China. So if you take that out, you get increasing female labor force participation rates, declining male labor force participation rates, and I'm at least offering an argument that in India, the story about declining labor force participation rates is over. It's the decline.
One, I just want to emphasize, I think the importance of what Dilip said. I think part of, a concern that I think this highlights is how to use labor force participation as a welfare outcome. And in particular, that's very relevant in a context where a lot of policies are pushed because they provide potentially labor force opportunities for women without having a clear theory of who's making the choice. So I've often said that microcredit often might have directly contributed to the fact that so many women were made to start a business to serve some particular goal of their husbands. And I think this is a general problem that I think to look at labor force participation as a measure of welfare seems to me to be deeply problematic. And unless we have a good theory of who's making the choice and how the choice is being sort of changed by the opportunities, I think we may misinterpret the effects of policies. The more small points, one thing I would love to see is, just because of what Farzana showed, and that sort of, you can imagine that a part of the change in labor force participation is a result of urbanization, so that neither group is going down, but the overall. And so it would be worth just looking at what part of that can you explain by just the composition effect. Finally, one class of interventions that you didn't talk about, and maybe there isn't that great evidence, but we have a student who has results from an experiment where it's in Mirzapur in UP, where what she does, she looks at kind of more self-efficacy interventions for women. Women self-selecting to not look for particular opportunities. So related to this question of when they say we would want to have the work in the home, are they also speaking about particular things that they feel that they can do? Lack of self-belief, that they couldn't go out and work in a factory. Is there an issue about lack of self-belief? And I think what she shows is that there's big effects. Once you do these self-efficacy treatments, you try to convince women that yes, you can do it. They go out and actually participate. They work in carpet factories here, and they go out and actually start working. So I think there is a general set of issues about, women being convinced that they can. I mean, it's clear from her kind of baseline data that women are convinced that they can't do these things. These things are too hard for them. They're for other kinds of women or something. And so I think that's a general class of thoughts to be maybe given more space.
Yes, Mihir Desai. So in the spirit of more descriptive data, it seems like there might be a missed opportunity with the district level variation. So I think there's one sentence in the paper about it, but there's actually a striking amount of district level variation in female labor force participation. Really remarkable amount of variation. And I don't think it can be fully explained by urban-rural, which is kind of what you use. So, and I assume male labor force participation is not nearly as variable at the district level. And there's even within state kind of large variation. So that seems like an opportunity to investigate at least some of these hypotheses.
Thank you. I'm just going to keep going. Yeah, please.
Then Abhijit said, it worries me that we get hung up on labor force participation rates, and both the efficiency, jump to the efficiency and the welfare implications of these without thinking them through. And suppose today we doubled women's wages or multiplied them by some factor. We could certainly find a factor that will get us to the labor force participation rates we want. It's not clear that that would be improving efficiency at all. Have the men, raise wages enough, the men will stay home, whether they look after the children or do something else, we don't know. But it's clear that that's not what we want. So I think thinking much more carefully about what market doesn't work or why we're in a bad equilibrium, what's the source of inefficiency, I think that's where we need to focus more of our energies. And so I think, again, this number that was given of 30%, so 30% of women say they would like to work, it would be useful, Charity, if we could have that number for the men. I bet it's some sizable number. How different is it from the women? I couldn't find it in the paper. So again, it's clear that for certain ages, there are interventions that can increase work participation and increase welfare, but then at other ages, women might be better off, given everything else, to be out of the labor force.
And no, I'm sorry, Ratna. And then I am really sorry, but I think I will have to, I think after Ratna, I will have to, can I keep going, Shekhar? I can keep going? Okay.
Okay, thank you. I am Ratna Sudarshan. First I want to say I was really delighted to see some emphasis on part-time work. This is probably the first time I'm reading something on women's work which actually highlights that. And I have sort of 2 points on that. The first is that while a certain proportion of our interest in part-time work would turn around upgrading, as Renana mentioned, of work that's already being done, there's no doubt that among the younger educated age group, there is actually a search for newer, different types of work. So I was wondering, how would you make we don't want gender conflictive situations where we are just reallocating existing work. It's really about where is the expansion in work and job opportunities? So I didn't see a connection, or, would you like to say something about, about the, how could we expand opportunities and not just, or else, because if it's gender conflictive, it's not necessarily going to improve the situation. My second comment is really, you said you mentioned Claudia Golden sort of in passing, but I think it's really important that we develop a more realistic narrative about women's work in this country. It cannot be a narrative that says, okay, we want higher rates of growth, we want more women in the workforce, and where are these women, and as The Economist did, because that simply doesn't touch the heart or the reality of women's lives in this country. So we really need a narrative that brings family into the picture. I mean, you said you can't attack marriage, right? You'd go nowhere if you did that. So what you need to do is incorporate marriage. So how do you develop an understanding of women's work that also includes an understanding of the implications of marriage in our present situation, and what would work, and how from there would you develop a sense of identity and purpose in work? And I actually feel that part-time work is very central to that narrative. So it would be great if you could develop that a little further. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a hand back there and then 3 more. And that, can I go that far, Shekhar? Thank you. And then I have 3, and it's too far for me to read the names.
Hi, I'm Renuka Sane. My comment is, I think Dr. Bardhan mentioned this, but I feel that safety is perhaps a very big issue when it comes to women's labor force participation, and we don't discuss it enough. And I'd like to tie that in with the comment that was made on how women prefer to work closer to home. And again, I would suggest caution in interpreting a policy recommendation out of that statement. From saying that, we should bring work closer to home, perhaps we should focus on how it's safer for women to go away from home. And maybe we should change that narrative around safety much more than we are doing in the present discussion.
Anushri Sinha from NCAER. My point is actually related to the policy thrust that should be. And if we are thinking of policies like Ujala and also other policies that help in electrification and infrastructure that helps women save time for care work, in a way I feel that reinforces the gender roles. So the issue is, I don't know how, but we need to think of how do you share both care work and outside work and unpaid work. And that should be thought of in a way, and that should come through. And I here suggest, I think that gender choices are not taken into account. The choice that the woman actually wants to make is not taken into account at all. We just say, okay, she's been given some facilities to save her time for care work, so that's her role anyway, she can do that, and then whatever residual time she has, that's what she can do for market work. So I'm just thinking through that, do we reinforce the roles all the time through all kinds of policies, and how do you change that? Thanks.
Premila Nazareth from NCAER. 2 very quick comments. The first is on the issue of mechanization. Some years ago, IFC had commissioned a report in which I was involved, looking at women's participation in the mining sector. So I went around interviewing all the big mining companies in India to ask them how they use women, why they use women, etc. One of the key things that came through was that the mining firms would love to use women more, but the problem is twofold. So at the high level, the mining engineers, we have a rule on the books, which still stands, by the way, that women are not permitted to work in underground mines as per law for our protection. And if you look at the site of the Labor Ministry, you will find proudly they also talk about how women are not allowed to work at night on the shop floor on factories. So we have 2 laws that are supposed to protect women, which actually hold us back from participating in a fuller way and in a better recognized way in key growth sectors. So the net result of the fact that these women can't be hired in underground mines is that a lot of the women who have trained for mining are going into IT, and the sort of top CEO track jobs are going to the men in mining and manufacturing because of these laws. So that's issue number one. Issue number two is very personal. I am the embodiment of all the trends that we have discussed. High career, high track career in my youth. I got married, I gave up everything for my child, partly pressure from the in-laws. Then just as that finished, now it's time to look after the old people. So I want to come back to the point that the two of them made here, Mihir and this lady here whose name I can't read. We have to change the narrative of how we think about women's participation in the workforce. So number one, what causes women to drop out? One is childbearing, and the second is looking after the old. On the issue of childbearing, I'd like to say we completely need to change the narrative. If women did not bear children, there would be no GDP in the next generation, there would be no workforce. So my whole life, I was made to feel that having given up to look after my child and raise a well-adjusted, healthy child, and again, it relates to this whole issue of early childhood nutrition, stimulation of the child in early childhood. Only a parent can do this best. So I think as a nation, we should pioneer a new economic thinking on childbearing. Women having children is GDP generation. It is not taking women out of the workforce. It is the most important work of the human race, and the Russians had remembered this and acknowledged this a long time ago. So it's my appeal to all you economists out there, let's change the way we think about this and really bring women into the real workforce.
Thank you. Charity?
Sure, thank you. This is on, right? I think there's no way I could do justice to all these comments. Thank you. They're very helpful, and I think, oh, sorry.
Rajneesh Mehra. I was very puzzled by the anomaly that India and Pakistan are so different than every other country, including neighboring countries. I was wondering, has anybody done, at least India shares large borders with Bangladesh and Nepal. Are there any controlled studies of seeing how the labor force participation is on one side of the border rather than the other? I mean, you couldn't have a discontinuous change. The other thing is when we talk about India, India is not a homogeneous country. There is so much of variation across states in terms of fertility, agricultural fertility, education levels, health outcomes. If you go from Bihar to Kerala, so has anybody exploited this variation to see if there's any systematic trend that picks up labor force participation or lack thereof?
Yeah, thank you so much. All these comments I think are really interesting and helpful. So I think first I'll talk about Pranab and Farzana's comments and then kind of try to address some of the things that were brought up by the audience as well. So the levels and the trends, thank you. That I think is really helpful, and we should be thinking about that more and disentangling a bit, so we'll be following up on that. Also, the AER article you mentioned and the book chapters, I want to look at that as well, so thank you. So I think, yeah, basically we'll just take those and incorporate. One thing that I think is coming out from just the audience comments in general is this issue of choice. And what's a woman's choice? What's welfare enhancing for her? Does she have a full opportunity set? Does she realize she has it or doesn't have it? And so I think, speaking to that, the comment that Abhijit made related to self-efficacy, he's not, I don't think is the first study that's starting to look at these types of issues, and it seems that those are in some way a starting point to really start thinking about female labor force participation and what women really want to do, and even providing information to them. It can be really helpful to help them understand what it is that they could do. One other thing I wanted to pick up on, I think Farzana mentioned it with this kind of window of opportunity. And we've definitely seen it. I don't say it in the paper, but if you look at willingness to work versus female labor force participation, you find the highest willingness to work, with all the known flaws of that question or kind of the conditions of it, among the youngest women, and yet they're actually the least likely to be participating in the labor force right now. And that to me is pretty striking. I think it does present an opportunity to help involve women in the labor force. These issues of self-efficacy come in. I think very young women often don't know what their chances or choices could be, and they also don't know how to negotiate within the household. And we've seen lots of times that women express interest in working, and yet household members will not let them do that. Some of it may relate to these safety issues. I think I completely agree that safety is an underappreciated issue right now. I mean, it's just kind of, it's something that people kind of bemoan, but I think there are economics behind it, and we should be thinking about it. And there are also policies in place that, from my perspective as a woman, I don't necessarily feel safer when there's a special car for me, because that means that all the women, I think Rohini has written about this too, all the women are isolated in one area. And so if you're the lone woman who doesn't get in the right metro car, you feel more vulnerable because you're unique in that situation. So how is policy actually affecting safety outcomes and perceptions of safety, I think is really important. There was an interesting job market paper, I think just this past year, looking at women's willingness to pay for increased safety, and basically the author finds that women pay a large safety premium, and I think it even, it translates into basically opting into education of lower quality, so they forego wages later on in life because they're really just trying to get to college in a more safely, so they go to kind of lower quality schools. There was something else I wanted to say related to, I think something that we don't really talk about in the paper is how, all of this really revolves around marriage markets. And the longer I spend time in India, the more I realize that marriage markets really are a caste issue, probably more than anything else. And so I think this is something that should be explored a little bit more as well. Dilip, to your point about norms and so on, we had a paper that came out where, this is an AEA-PNP just in May, looking at the social costs to men when their wives work and their perceived social cost. And we find, this is in northern Madhya Pradesh, we find that men report a couple different things. One is that community respect for them is of utmost importance. For women, they would say things like obedience or subservience was something that was most important to them. And then in terms of what they report, a social cost, is there a social cost to you if your wife works? They report that there's a cost and that it's higher to them than for their wives. And so there's a lot, I think, related to kind of some of these community dynamics that we have underappreciated so far that are relevant to kind of the equilibriums that we're seeing. I'm trying to think if there's anything. The point about quotas and reservation, I think when we wrote the paper, we were a little bit cavalier. And I would think that more market-based mechanisms to address private sector issues would be, helpful. So I definitely agree with that. I'm sure I've absolutely missed a lot of comments. Thank you for the comments on technology. I think, that's really relevant. We don't talk about it much. Be nice to see more data on it. I think that's part of the reason it's kind of not in there. And to this point about part-time work, I feel like saying that women are asking for part-time work, it's a dangerous place to be, because we're basically saying this is a good situation for them, and it does reinforce gender norms. So I think point taken, and I'm not quite sure how to deal with that, but it's something that we should consider, in this work and others moving ahead. So.
I don't really much to say to react. Just three minor points. One is Dilip's point about interaction between poverty of the household and norms. I think I entirely agree. I don't remember saying anything to the contrary. Similarly, Abhijit's point about the welfare, in fact, I think that's a very important aspect. I very briefly alluded to it when I said women's welfare participation declining is not necessarily welfare decreasing, but I agree with the general point. A third point, I think, also relates to Abhijit, is the rural-urban, and also Farzana talked about it. I just want to add something to it. Yes, with urbanization, if you look at the aggregate participation, that certainly has the increasing urbanization has an effect. But if you do the rural-urban decomposition, you see roughly in the usual status data, urban has more or less remained stable, urban participation. It's rural that has a substantial decline. That's why I was emphasizing more the factors which might be causing rural decline. But that's the important asymmetry in the two sectors. Let me stop there.
Thank you. Farzana? No, I don't.
No, I just wanted to say that I agree with the point raised about welfare implications. And I think it's important to sort of theorize on what exactly is happening in terms of when women withdraw from the labor market, as we see at least in the rural areas, if not in the urban areas. And that goes back to the point that was raised about what are these women doing when they're withdrawing. They could be spending a lot more time at home in terms of rearing the children. And that's the point that we brought out in this paper that I was referring to that's just come out. Essentially that the returns from investing in household, in human capital formation or in home production could be higher now because the returns, as opposed to the returns you're getting in the market, because the wages that you're receiving could be much less given that education of women has gone up, given that earlier if they were self-employed, they don't have those opportunities if you're looking specifically at rural areas. And so we also need to think in terms of intergenerational transmissions in time that women are spending at home. Is that enhancing human capital formation in terms of the investments they're making in their children? And that's all of that holding norms constant. Norms in the sense of the gender division of time at home is not changing. And if we want to change that, then that's a different issue that needs to be tackled with a different set of policies and including changing women's behavioral behavior towards the question that was the point that was raised about self-efficacy and self-belief. Those are separate issues, I think, than from the ones that we are looking at holding norms the way they are, the way they exist today.
Sorry, I had one more comment. Sorry, just one last thing related to the secondary activities. I agree that's really important, and it's not in the paper, but I thought it would be relevant to at least mention in this group, and this kind of ties into marriage, and which I was talking about earlier. When we look at the secondary status of women's time use in the previous week, it's actually very interesting. We see that women who are unmarried obviously have more time for market work. Women who are married, regardless of whether they have children or not, are occupied with domestic duties. And I think there is this narrative that childcare is kind of the constraining factor. I don't think that the data actually holds that up. I think it's actually marriage itself and the responsibilities that go along with that.
Okay, thank you. And I think we'll end this here. And thank you all for a very productive discussion. And I'm especially thankful because the earlier discussions on women and work is usually about the supply side and norms. And this is what happens when income goes up and family. But here we've had a much more rounded discussion. So thank you all very much.